How does one man, armed with nothing but a wrench and sheer determination, keep an entire bombing campaign alive when everything is falling apart? March 9, 1945. Saipan, Mariana Island. The airfields of Ily Field are alive with the thunder of Wright R-3350 engines as B-29 Superfortresses prepare for the most ambitious firebombing raid in history. Tonight, 334 bombers will strike Tokyo, dropping over 1,600 tons of incendiaries on the Japanese capital. But there's a problem that threatens to ground the entire operation: a critical shortage of functioning aircraft caused by mechanical failures, combat damage, and the brutal wear of constant operations. Standing in the middle of this chaos is Technical Sergeant Robert "Bobby" Klein, a 24-year-old aircraft mechanic from Youngstown, Ohio. While generals plan strategy and pilots receive their final briefings, Klein is fighting a different kind of war, one fought with tools instead of guns, where victory is measured in engines repaired and aircraft returned to service. What he accomplishes over the next 36 hours will become the stuff of legend within the 73rd Bombardment Wing, though his name would remain virtually unknown outside the tight-knit community of maintainers who kept America's strategic bombing campaign alive. This is the story of how one mechanic's extraordinary effort prevented a military disaster and helped secure one of the most devastating air raids of World War II. To understand what Robert Klein faced that night, you must first understand the B-29 Superfortress and the impossible demands placed upon it. The Boeing B-29 was the most advanced bomber of World War II, a gleaming aluminum giant with a 141-foot wingspan, pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled gun turrets, and 4 massive Wright R-3350 Cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower. It could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs across distances exceeding 3,000 miles. It was also a maintenance nightmare. The R-3350 engine was a marvel of engineering that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with 1940s technology. It was also temperamental, prone to overheating, and had an alarming tendency to catch fire. Mechanics nicknamed the engines wrong R-3350S because they seemed designed to fail. Cylinder head temperatures would spike unpredictably. Oil consumption was excessive. Magneto failures were common. And the engine's complexity meant that repairs required both extensive training and hard-won experience. Robert Klein had both. Born in 1921 to a family of steelworkers, Klein had grown up surrounded by machinery. His father worked the blast furnaces, and young Bobby spent his teenage years rebuilding car engines in the family garage. When he enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1942, his mechanical aptitude was immediately recognized. After basic training, he was sent to the Air Force Technical School at Shanyot Field, Illinois, where he spent 8 months learning everything about aircraft engines theory, practice, and troubleshooting. By the time he arrived in the Marianas in late 1944, Klein was assigned to the 497th Bombardment Group as part of the 73rd Bombardment Wing. He quickly distinguished himself as one of the most skilled engine mechanics on Saipan. While other mechanics could follow technical manuals and perform routine maintenance, Klein had an almost intuitive understanding of how the R-3350 worked. He could diagnose problems by sound alone: the subtle miss of a failing cylinder, the whine of a bad bearing, the irregular pitch that indicated magneto trouble. His commanding officer, Captain James Mitchell, had noted in Klein's December 1944 performance review, "Sergeant Klein possesses exceptional mechanical aptitude and works with outstanding efficiency under pressure. Recommend for technical sergeant and assignment to flight line lead crew." Klein was promoted in January 1945 and given responsibility for a team of 6 mechanics, but he never stopped working with his hands. While other technical sergeants focused on supervision and paperwork, Klein remained in the thick of repairs, believing that leadership meant working alongside his men, not above them. The strategic situation in early March 1945 was critical. General Curtis LeMay, commander of 21 Bomber Command, had taken over operations in the Marianas in January and immediately began revolutionizing American bombing tactics. Frustrated by the poor results of high-altitude precision bombing, Japanese war industries remained largely intact despite months of raids. LeMay decided on a radical change in strategy. He would send the B-29s in at low altitude at night, stripped of most defensive armament to carry maximum bomb loads. They would drop incendiaries instead of high explosives, targeting not factories but the dense urban areas where Japanese war workers lived. It was area bombing, pure and simple, and it would either win the war or cost LeMay his career. The raid scheduled for the night of March 9th to 10th was the test of this new strategy. Every available aircraft would be needed, but as the sun rose on March 8th, the The 73rd Bombardment Wing faced a crisis that threatened the entire operation. March 8, 1945, began with a routine morning briefing at the 497th Bombardment Group Maintenance Hangar. Technical Sergeant Klein arrived at 0600 hours, coffee in hand, expecting the usual litany of mechanical issues, minor repairs, routine inspections, perhaps one or two engines requiring major work. What he heard instead turned his blood cold. Captain Mitchell stood before the assembled maintenance crews with a clipboard and a grim expression. "Gentlemen, we have a problem. As of 0500 hours this morning, the 497th has 46 aircraft assigned. Of those 46, only 31 are currently capable. That's a 67% readiness rate, well below the 85% minimum required for tomorrow night's operation." The room fell silent. A 67% readiness rate was catastrophic. Every group in the 73rd Wing was expected to put maximum aircraft into the air. The mission's success depended on overwhelming numbers, over 300 bombers arriving over Tokyo in a concentrated stream that would saturate Japanese defenses. Mitchell continued, reading from his clipboard. "We have 7 aircraft with major engine problems. 4 have sustained combat damage requiring extensive airframe repairs. 3 have hydraulic system failures. 1 has a complete electrical system failure." He looked up from the clipboard, his eyes scanning the room. "Group Operations has informed me that every single bomber in the 73rd Wing is needed for tomorrow's mission. Not 85%, not 90%, 100%. Which means we have roughly 36 hours to get 15 aircraft from non-mission capable status to fully operational." The math was simple and brutal. 15 aircraft requiring major repairs and only 36 hours until takeoff. Each aircraft needed to be fully repaired, tested, and certified within an average of 2.4 hours. But many of these repairs normally took 12 to 16 hours of work. "This is impossible, sir," said Master Sergeant William Torres, the Assistant Maintenance Chief. "We don't have the parts, we don't have the manpower, and we certainly don't have the time." "Then we make it possible," Mitchell replied. "Because if we don't, good men are going to die. Fewer bombers means weaker defensive formations. Weaker formations means Japanese fighters will tear apart our aircraft. We put up every available B-29, or we condemn our own people to death." He turned to Klein. "Sergeant Klein, the 7 aircraft with engine problems are your responsibility. I'm giving you complete authority over engine repairs, parts allocation, and personnel assignment. Pull whoever you need from other sections. Cannibalize parts from any non-critical aircraft. Do whatever it takes, but get those engines running." Klein felt the weight of the assignment settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. 7 engines, 36 hours. It was impossible, but refusing wasn't an option. "Yes, sir," he said. "We'll get it done." By 0700 hours, Klein had assembled his team and begun assessing the damage. 7 aircraft with engine problems represented a catalog of everything that could go wrong with the 3350. Aircraft 4469803, Heavenly Body. Number 3 engine had suffered complete magneto failure during the previous mission. Both magnetos would need to be replaced, a 6-hour job under ideal conditions. Dragon Lady. Number 2 engine was consuming excessive oil and showing dangerously high cylinder head temperatures, likely because failed piston rings requiring engine disassembly. Tokyo Express. Number 1 engine had seized during ground run-up that morning due to catastrophic bearing failure. The entire engine would need to be removed and replaced, the most time-consuming repair possible. Hell's Angels. Number 4 engine had suffered battle damage during the March 4th raid, with shrapnel puncturing the oil cooler and severing multiple fuel lines. Extensive repairs required. Aircraft 4469841. Packing Mama. Number 3 engine showed irregular power output and rough running, suggesting timing problems or possible valve damage. Lethal Lady. Number 1 and number 2 engines, both showing signs of spark plug fouling and misfiring, likely caused by contaminated fuel. All plugs would need replacement and fuel systems flushed. Aircraft 4469862. The uninvited number 4 engine had backfired during startup, causing internal fire damage to the carburetor and intake manifold. Looking at this list, Klein calculated the man-hours required. Under normal circumstances, with standard procedures and adequate staffing, these repairs would require approximately 180 man-hours of work. He had 36 hours to complete everything. Even if he worked his team around the clock with no breaks, the math didn't add up. There was only one solution: abandon standard procedures, work simultaneously on all aircraft, cannibalize parts from wherever they could be found. and keep working until the job was done. At 0800 hours, Klein gathered his expanded team. He'd pulled 14 additional mechanics from other sections, giving him a total of 20 men. He stood before them in the humid morning heat of Saipan, flight lines stretching behind him with rows of aluminum bombers glinting in the sun. "I'm not going to lie to you," he began. "What we're being asked to do is impossible by every standard procedure in the technical manuals. But those manuals were written by engineers in California who never had to launch a maximum effort raid with insufficient resources. We're mechanics in the Marianas, and we're going to do this anyway." He outlined his plan. The team would split into 7 crews, 1 per aircraft. Each crew would have a lead mechanic responsible for diagnosing and directing repairs. Klein himself would rotate between aircraft, providing expertise wherever problems arose. They would work in continuous shifts, no breaks, except to eat and drink. Sleep would have to wait until the aircraft were mission ready. "We're going to violate every regulation about work hours and safety procedures," Klein admitted, "and I'm taking full responsibility for that. If anyone gets hurt, or if something goes wrong, I'll face the court-martial. But we're getting these birds in the air." By 0900 hours, the maintenance crews were swarming over the damaged aircraft. The flight line became a scene of controlled chaos, the screech of air wrenches, the clang of tools, the shouts of mechanics calling for parts and assistance. The tropical heat was already oppressive, with temperatures approaching 85 degrees and humidity making every movement feel like working in a steam bath. Klein started with the most challenging repair: complete engine replacement on Tokyo Express. Aircraft 44 to 69,825's number. One engine was ruined beyond repair. The crankshaft seized solid from bearing failure. The only solution was to swap it with a spare engine from the parts depot. But when Klein checked with supply, he discovered a problem. There were no spare R-3350 engines available on Saipan. Every spare had been used in previous repairs. The nearest replacement engines were on Guam, 120 miles away, and wouldn't arrive for at least 48 hours. Klein stood beneath the massive propeller of Tokyo Express, looking up at the cowling of the failed engine, and made a decision that would have horrified any engineering officer who learned of it. "We're going to steal an engine from a non-operational aircraft," he told his crew chief, Corporal Dennis Walsh. "Find me a B-29 that's grounded for long-term repairs, something that won't fly for at least a weekend. We'll pull one of its engines." Walsh's eyes widened.
"Oh, Sergeant, that's unauthorized cannibalization."
"We could get court-martialed for that." "Add it to the list," Klein replied. "Find me that engine." Walsh located a suitable donor aircraft within the Our Aircraft 4469743, which had suffered major structural damage during a crash landing and was awaiting parts for airframe repairs. It wouldn't fly for at least 2 weeks. More importantly, all 4 of its engines were functional. By 1100 hours, Klein's crew had begun the delicate process of removing the number 2 engine from the donor aircraft. An R-3350 engine weighed over 2,600 pounds. Removing it required disconnecting hundreds of connections: fuel lines, oil lines, hydraulic lines, electrical cables, control linkages, then carefully lowering the massive engine assembly from its mounting on an engine hoist. It was precision work that normally took an 8-man crew about 6 hours. Klein did it with 4 men in 3 hours. "Faster," he urged, as his crew worked to disconnect the final mounting bolts. While the engine removal progressed, Klein moved between the other aircraft, diagnosing problems and directing repairs. At Heavenly Body, the magneto replacement was proceeding smoothly. That crew would finish within the estimated time frame. At Dragon Lady, however, his worst fears were confirmed. The engine would need to be partially disassembled to replace failed piston rings, a 12-hour job at minimum. "We don't have 12 hours, Klein told Sergeant Frank Morrison, the lead mechanic on that aircraft. "We have 8 hours before I need you and your crew on other repairs." "So you're going to work faster than you've ever worked in your life." Morrison, a veteran mechanic from Detroit, nodded grimly. "We'll get it done, Sarge." By 1400 hours, the situation was rapidly escalating into a full-scale emergency. Word had spread through the 73rd Bombardment Wing that the 497th Bombardment Group was facing a critical maintenance crisis. Other groups began volunteering assistance: additional mechanics, parts, equipment. Captain Mitchell coordinated this influx of support, directing resources where they were most needed. But even with additional help, the timeline remained brutally tight. The mission briefing was scheduled for 1700 hours on March 9th, just 27 hours away. After the briefing, crews would need time for final preparations, pre-flight checks, and engine warm-ups before the first takeoff at approximately 1800 hours, which meant Klein had to complete all repairs, conduct engine run-ups, certify every aircraft as mission-ready by no later than 1,500 hours on March 9th. He had 25 hours left. By 1,800 hours on March 8th, exhaustion was already setting in. The crews had been working for 12 straight hours in brutal heat and humidity. Klein himself had consumed nothing but coffee and a sandwich since dawn. His hands were cut and bruised from working with tools. His uniform was soaked with sweat and stained with oil and hydraulic fluid. But the work was progressing. The stolen engine from the donor aircraft had been successfully removed and was being transported to Tokyo Express on a maintenance cart. The magneto replacement on Heavenly Body was complete, and that aircraft was already undergoing engine run-up tests. The repairs on Hell's Angels were moving faster than expected. The battle damage, while extensive, was relatively straightforward to fix. As darkness fell over Saipan, the flight line transformed into a surreal landscape of light and shadow. Massive floodlights on portable generators illuminated the B-29s, casting harsh white light that created stark contrasts. Mechanics worked in pools of brightness, surrounded by tropical darkness. The steady drone of generators mixed with the sounds of tools and occasional engine tests. Klein had entered what he later described as a state of pure focus, a mental space where exhaustion, hunger, and physical discomfort faded into background noise. There was only the work, the next problem to solve, the next repair to complete. At 2,200 hours, disaster struck. The crew installing the replacement engine on Tokyo Express had just completed the delicate process of mounting the 2,600-pound power plant when a securing bolt sheared under stress. The engine, suspended from the hoist, shifted violently. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the entire engine would tear loose and crash to the ground, causing catastrophic damage that would take days to repair. Corporal Walsh dove beneath the engine, bracing it with his shoulder, while two other mechanics scrambled to secure the hoist. The weight was immense, over 2,600 pounds, resting partially on Walsh's body. He screamed from the pain, but held position long enough for the hoist to be stabilized. Klein arrived at a dead run. Get that engine secured. Now, working with frantic speed, the crew reset the hoist and installed new securing bolts. Walsh was pulled clear, his shoulder dislocated, and his collarbone possibly cracked. But the engine was safe. The medics arrived minutes later to take Walsh to the base hospital. Klein watched the ambulance drive away and felt the crushing weight of command responsibility. One of his men was injured because Klein had pushed them to work faster than was safe. The guilt was immediate and sharp. But there was no time for guilt. There were 6 aircraft still needing repairs and less than 20 hours remaining. Get back to work, he ordered, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. We finished this for Walsh. By midnight on March 8th, Technical Sergeant Robert Klein was operating on pure willpower and black coffee. He'd been working for 18 consecutive hours, and his body was beginning to rebel. His hands trembled from fatigue, his vision occasionally blurred, but the work continued. The status report at midnight was mixed. Of the 7 aircraft requiring major engine repairs, 3 were now mission-capable. Heavenly Body with its new magnetos, Hell's Angels with its repaired battle damage, and Lethal Lady with fresh spark plugs and flushed fuel systems. 4 aircraft remained non-operational, Tokyo Express with its engine replacement still in progress, Dragon Lady with its partial engine disassembly, Packing Mama with unresolved timing issues, and the Uninvited with fire-damaged carburetor systems. For aircraft, 18 hours. The math was becoming more favorable. But new problems kept emerging with the complexity that always seemed to plague the R-3350 engine. At Dragon Lady, Sergeant Morrison's crew had successfully disassembled the number 2 engine and exposed the failed piston rings. But when they attempted to install replacement rings, they discovered that the parts depot had provided the wrong specifications, rings designed for an earlier R-3350 model that didn't fit the current engine configuration. Morrison found Klein working on Packing Mama and delivered the bad news. Sarge, we've got the wrong piston rings. Supply doesn't have the correct parts in stock. They're trying to locate some from other groups, but it could take hours. Klein's exhausted mind raced through the options. He couldn't wait hours for correct parts. The timeline was too tight. Couldn't leave Dragon Lady non-operational. Every aircraft was needed. And they couldn't operate the engine with failed piston rings. It would catastrophically fail during the mission, likely killing the crew. Then Klein remembered something. During his training at Chanute Field, one of his instructors had demonstrated an emergency field modification technique, way to hand-file oversized piston rings to fit engines when correct parts weren't available. It was tedious, dangerous work that required absolute precision. Done incorrectly, the rings would fail immediately, potentially destroying the engine, but it was possible. We're going to hand file the rings, Klein announced. Morrison looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. Sarge, that's insane. Filing piston rings by hand in field conditions. The tolerances are measured in thousandths of an inch. One mistake, and we destroy the engine. You have a better idea? Klein asked. When Morrison remained silent, Klein continued. Get me the finest files we have, a set of feeler gauges, and a micrometer. We're doing this. For the next 4 hours, Klein worked with microscopic precision, hand-filing the oversized piston rings to exact specifications. It was agonizing work that required complete concentration despite his bone-deep exhaustion. Each ring had to be filed uniformly around its entire circumference, maintaining perfect roundness while reducing the diameter by mere thousandths of an inch. Too much filing and the ring would be too loose, allowing combustion gases to escape and reducing engine power. It's a little filing and the ring wouldn't fit, making installation impossible. Klein worked by feel as much as by measurement, his fingers detecting variations in diameter that the instruments could barely register. His hands cramped from the repetitive motion. His eyes burned from focusing on the tiny tolerances. But slowly, painstakingly, he handcrafted 7 piston rings to exact specifications. By 0 hours on March 9th, the custom-filed rings were ready for installation. Morrison's crew worked with extreme care, sliding each ring into position and verifying correct fit, which was delicate. Work piston rings are brittle and can shatter if handled roughly. But Morrison's team had the skill and experience to do it right. At 0530 hours, with dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky, the reassembled No. 2 engine of Dragon Lady was ready for testing. Klein stood beside the aircraft as the crew chief started the engine. The R-3350 coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a deep, powerful sound that was the most beautiful thing Klein had ever heard. The engine ran smoothly. Oil pressure was normal. Cylinder head temperatures remained within acceptable ranges. The hand-filed piston rings were holding perfectly. Dragon Lady was mission capable, but 3 aircraft still remained non-operational, and Klein now had less than 11 hours until the mission briefing. At Tokyo Express, the replacement engine installation had hit multiple snags. The electrical harness from the donor aircraft didn't quite match the wiring configuration of the recipient aircraft, requiring time-consuming rewiring. The fuel lines needed custom fitting because of slight variations in engine mounting positions. And worst of all, when the crew attempted to connect the propeller assembly, they discovered that the propeller reduction gearbox had been damaged during the engine removal, a problem no one had noticed until now. A damaged reduction gearbox meant the propeller couldn't be properly attached, and without a propeller the engine was useless. They needed a replacement gearbox, but like the spare engines there were none available on Saipan. Klein stood beneath Tokyo Express at 0600 hours, staring up at the massive engine that represented 20 hours of backbreaking work, and felt despair beginning to creep in. They had come so far, sacrificed so much, and now a single damaged component threatened to undo everything. Then inspiration struck the kind of desperate. It's a brilliant idea that only comes from extreme exhaustion, combined with absolute necessity. The donor aircraft, Klein said suddenly. We pulled this engine from a B-29 that's grounded for airframe repairs. That aircraft still has 3 good engines with 3 good reduction gearboxes. We go back and pull the gearbox from the engine next to the one we took. Corporal Thomas Fletcher, who had taken over Walsh's responsibilities after the injury, shook his head. Sarge, removing a reduction gearbox from a mounted engine is even harder than pulling the whole engine. We're talking 6 hours minimum, and we don't have 6 hours. Then we do it in 3, Klein replied. Come on. The crew raced back to the donor aircraft 4469743 and began the complex process of removing a reduction gearbox from a mounted engine. It required disconnecting the propeller, removing dozens of bolts, carefully extracting the gearbox assembly without damaging the delicate gearing inside, and reversing the process to install it on Tokyo Express. Klein drove his crew with an intensity that bordered on recklessness. Faster. We don't have time for by-the-book procedures. Use your judgment, use your experience, but move faster. By 0830 hours, the replacement gearbox was installed on Tokyo Express. At 0900 hours, propeller was finally mounted and secured. At 0930 hours, after 28 hours of continuous work, the No. 1 engine of Tokyo Express was ready for testing. Klein personally conducted the engine run-up. He advanced the throttle slowly, watching the gauges with hawk-like intensity. Engine RPM climbed smoothly. Oil pressure was good. The propeller turned without vibration. All cylinder head temperatures were within normal ranges. Tokyo Express was mission capable. 2 aircraft remained, Packing Mama with its timing issues, and the Uninvited with its fire-damaged carburetor. At 1,000 hours, just 5 hours before the mission briefing, Klein forced himself to eat a real meal for the first time in 28 hours. The base mess had prepared sandwiches and coffee for the maintenance crews, and Captain Mitchell personally ordered Klein to take a 20-minute break. Klein sat in the shade of a revetment, mechanically chewing a ham sandwich that tasted like cardboard. His hands were shaking uncontrollably from exhaustion. Every muscle in his body ached. He had been awake for 40 hours straight, with only brief moments of rest stolen while moving between aircraft. But the end was in sight. 2 more aircraft. 5 more hours. They were going to make it. Except they weren't. At 10:30 hours, as Klein returned to work on Packing Mama, a runner arrived from Group Operations with devastating news. The mission schedule had been moved up. Due to weather concerns over Japan, General LeMay had ordered all aircraft to launch 1 hour earlier than planned. The mission briefing was now scheduled for 1600 hours instead of 1700 hours. First takeoff would be at 1700 hours, the 497th bombardment. Group would launch the most important mission of the war with 2 aircraft short of maximum strength. Somewhere over Tokyo, because of his failure, B-29s would be more vulnerable to Japanese fighters. Men would die because he couldn't work fast enough. For perhaps 30 seconds, Klein allowed himself to feel the crushing weight of that failure. Then he pushed the despair aside and got back to work. "We're not giving up," he told his exhausted crews. "We have 4 hours. We're going to work miracles for 4 hours, and we're going to save every life we can. Move." What happened over the next 4 hours would become the stuff of legend among aircraft maintainers throughout the Pacific Theater, though the full story would take years to emerge. At 10:30 hours, with 240 minutes remaining until the mission briefing, Technical Sergeant Robert Klein made a decision that defined his entire approach to the crisis. He would personally take direct control of both remaining aircraft repairs, abandoning any pretense of supervision in favor of hands-on work. He split his remaining crew, now numbering 18 mechanics after various injuries and reassignments, into 2 teams of 9. Team 1 would tackle Packing Mama and its timing issues. Team 2 would address the Uninvited and its fire-damaged carburetor. Klein would float between both aircraft, working wherever the problem was most critical. Packing Mama presented a particularly frustrating challenge. The number 3 engine was showing irregular power output and rough running, symptoms that pointed to either ignition timing problems or valve timing problem. But diagnosing which system was at fault required systematic testing that consumed precious time. Klein knew a shortcut, a diagnostic technique that wasn't in any technical manual, but had been taught to him by an old-timer mechanic during his training. By listening to the engine's sound at specific RPM ranges, while simultaneously feeling the vibrations transmitted through the airframe, an experienced mechanic could sometimes distinguish between ignition timing issues, which produced a sharp, irregular beat, and valve timing issues, which produced a deeper, more rhythmic variation. He climbed into the cockpit, started the number 3 engine, and spent 10 minutes running it through different power settings while pressing his hands against the cockpit structure to feel the vibrations. His exhausted brain processed the sensory information, the sound frequencies, the vibration patterns, the subtle variations in how the engine responded to throttle inputs. Finally, he shut down the engine and climbed out. "It's ignition timing," he announced to his team. "The magnetos are firing out of sequence. We need to retime the ignition system." Retiming an R-3350's ignition system was delicate work that required rotating the engine to specific positions and adjusting the magneto timing to exact specifications. Under normal circumstances, it was a 3-hour job requiring careful attention to detail. Klein's team completed it in 90 minutes through a combination of experience, skill, and working at speeds that would have horrified any training instructor. By 12:30 hours, Packing Mama was ready for engine run-up. Klein personally conducted the test, and this time the engine ran like a dream-smooth power across all RPM ranges. No vibration, no irregular running. After 33 hours of continuous maintenance operations, 6 of the 7 critically damaged aircraft were mission-ready, the Uninvited. The fire damage to the carburetor and intake manifold was extensive. The carburetor itself would need to be completely replaced, and the intake manifold required careful inspection for warping or cracking caused by the intense heat of the fire. If the manifold was damaged, it would also need replacement. Klein knew for certain that the parts depot had no spare intake manifolds on Saipan. At 12:45 hours, with just over 3 hours remaining, Klein's team removed the damaged carburetor and found what they feared most. The intake manifold showed clear signs of heat damage, with hairline cracks visible in the aluminum casting. An intake manifold with cracks couldn't be used. It would leak air, disrupting the fuel-air mixture and causing engine failure. The official solution was to replace the manifold, but without spares available, that solution was impossible. Klein examined the cracks closely. They were small, barely visible to the naked eye, and appeared to be surface cracks rather than structural failures. In theory, if the cracks could be sealed, the manifold might still be usable. But sealing cracks in an intake manifold that operated at high temperatures and extreme pressures was difficult. Then Klein remembered something else from his training, an emergency repair technique using high-temperature epoxy compound. The material was designed for temporary repairs to exhaust systems and could withstand temperatures up to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. If applied correctly, it might seal the hairline cracks well enough to allow the engine to operate for one mission. It was a gamble. If the repair failed during flight, the engine would lose power, potentially forcing the aircraft to abort the mission, or even threatening the crew's safety if they were over enemy territory. But if they didn't make the repair, the aircraft definitely wouldn't fly. "We're sealing the cracks with high-temp epoxy," Klein announced. "It's a field-expedient repair that might hold for one mission." Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, the lead mechanic for Team 2, voiced the concern everyone was thinking. "Sarge, if that repair fails over Japan, the crew might not make it home." Klein met his eyes. "If we don't repair this aircraft, 333 bombers go to Tokyo instead of 334. That means weaker defensive formations and more vulnerability to fighters. Some crew definitely won't make it home." He paused. "We give them the best repair we can. We test it thoroughly, and we let the pilot make the final call on whether to fly." The team worked with meticulous care, cleaning the cracked areas, applying the high-temperature epoxy, and allowing it to cure under the heat of portable heaters to accelerate the process. It was agonizingly slow work while the clock ticked down. 1,300 hours. 1,330 hours. 1,400 hours. At 1,430 hours, just 90 minutes before the mission briefing, the repaired intake manifold was reinstalled. At 1,445 hours, the replacement carburetor was mounted and connected. At 1,500 hours, the cowling was closed and secured. Klein looked at the completed work and felt a complex mixture of pride and dread. They had accomplished something that every regulation said was impossible. They had repaired 7 critically damaged aircraft in just over 33 hours, an average of less, and 5 hours per aircraft for repairs that should have taken 12 to 16 hours each. But one of those repairs, the epoxy-sealed intake manifold on the Uninvited, was questionable at best and potentially dangerous at worst. "Start the engine," Klein ordered. "We're going to run it at full power for 30 minutes. If the repair is going to fail, I want it to fail here on Saipan, not over Tokyo." At 15:05 hours, the number 4 engine of the Uninvited roared to life. Watched the gauges intently as the crew chief advanced the throttle. Engine RPM climbed. 1,500, 2,000, 2,200. Manifold pressure increased. Cylinder head temperatures rose into normal operating ranges. AK's no indication that the epoxy seal was failing. Klein ordered the engine run at full military power, the maximum continuous power setting, for 30 minutes, while the mission briefing was underway in the operations building. The Uninvited sat on the flight line with its number 4 engine roaring at full power, the propeller creating a hurricane of wind and noise. 30 minutes later, at 15:35 hours, the engine was shut down. Klein personally inspected the repaired intake manifold, looking for any signs of epoxy failure or new cracks. The manifold was intact. The repair had held under full power operation. The Uninvited was mission capable. At 15:40 hours, Technical Sergeant Robert Klein walked into the 497th Bombardment Group Operations Building covered head to toe in oil, hydraulic fluid, sweat, and grime. He had been awake for over 45 hours. He could barely stand without swaying from exhaustion. His hands were cut, bruised, and trembling. He found Captain Mitchell reviewing final mission paperwork and rendered a salute that was more of a tired wave. "Sir," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting over engine noise for the past day and a half, "all 7 aircraft are mission ready. The 497th has 46 aircraft available for tonight's operation. 100% of assigned strength." Mitchell looked up from his paperwork, his expression transforming from concentration to disbelief. "All 7. Even Tokyo Express." "All 7, sir," Klein confirmed. "I need to brief you on the Uninvited, though." The number 4 engine has a field expedient repair to the intake manifold that we can't guarantee beyond one mission. I recommend informing the aircraft commander and giving him the option to fly or stand down." Mitchell stood and gripped Klein's shoulder. "Sergeant, what you and your men have accomplished is nothing short of miraculous. Get yourself to the crew quarters and get some sleep." "That's an order." "Can't, sir," Klein replied. "Need to be here for engine start and taxi. Any problems come up, I need to be available to fix them." Mitchell studied his exhausted maintenance sergeant for a long moment. "Very well, but you're not working alone. I'm assigning 3 mechanics to shadow you. If you collapse, they'll catch you and carry you to the hospital." At 1600 hours, as 334 B-29 crews filed into briefing rooms across the Mariana Islands to learn about the most ambitious firebombing raid in history, Technical Sergeant Robert Klein was back on the flight line, conducting final inspections of his 7 repaired aircraft. At 1645 hours, flight crews arrived at their aircraft and began pre-flight checks. Lieutenant James Bradford, the aircraft commander of the Uninvited, sought out Klein to discuss the emergency repair to his number 4 engine. "Sergeant, I understand you performed a field repair that might not hold for the entire mission," Bradford said. "Give me your honest assessment. Should I fly this bird?" Klein met the pilot's eyes. "Sir, I've tested that repair under full power for 30 minutes, and it held solid. The epoxy is rated for the temperatures and pressures your engine will experience, but it's an emergency repair, not a factory job. There's risk." Bradford considered this. "Sergeant, if my aircraft doesn't fly, that's 1 fewer bomber over Tokyo. What would you do in my position?" "I'd fly, sir," Klein replied without hesitation. "I'd fly because my crew and I signed up to fight, because every aircraft in the air makes all our brothers safe." Bradford nodded slowly. "Then we fly." "Thank you, Sergeant." At 1700 hours, engines began starting across Wiley Field. The sound was incredible, hundreds of R-3350 engines roaring to life, creating a thunder that shook the ground. One by one, the massive B-29 Superfortresses taxied to the runway, their aluminum skins glowing in the late afternoon sun. Klein stood at the edge of the flight line, watching his 7 repaired aircraft taxi past. Heavenly Body, Dragon Lady, Tokyo Express, Hell's Angels, Packing Mama, Lethal Lady. The Uninvited, each one represented impossible hours of work, injuries sustained, regulations violated, and desperate improvisations that somehow succeeded. At 1740 hours, the first B-29 began its takeoff roll. At 1742 hours, it lifted into the air, climbing steadily into the Pacific sky. Every 60 seconds, another bomber followed a carefully choreographed ballet of aluminum and fire. With 334 aircraft launching into a mission that would change the course of the war, Klein watched until the last aircraft disappeared into the distance, heading northwest toward Japan. Then, finally, his exhausted body reached its absolute limit. He collapsed where he stood, caught by the 3 mechanics Captain Mitchell had assigned to shadow him. They carried him to the base hospital, where he slept for 14 hours straight. The story of Technical Sergeant Robert Klein reminds us that wars are not won solely by the men who fly the missions or fire the guns. Behind every successful combat operation are countless support personnel, the mechanics, the armorers, the supply clerks, the communications specialists, whose names rarely appear in history books but whose contributions are absolutely essential to victory. For every pilot who became an ace, there was a mechanic who kept his aircraft flying. For every successful bombing raid, there were maintenance crews working through the night to repair battle damage and mechanical failures. For every medal awarded for valor in combat, there should be recognition for the quiet heroism of those who worked in the shadows, solving impossible problems with limited resources and unlimited determination. Robert Klein's 45-hour marathon to restore 7 B-29s to mission-capable status before the March 9-10, 1945 Tokyo raid stands as one of the most remarkable maintenance achievements in military history. But it also stands as a representative example of the thousands of similar efforts performed by equally dedicated maintainers throughout the war that collectively made Allied victory possible. These stories matter. They remind us that heroism takes many forms, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons but with tools, not in the sky but on the ground, not for glory, but simply because the job needs doing. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Secrets, reborn as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.